The knock on my door wasn't a neighborly tap. It was the hard, insistent rap of manufactured authority. 3 strangers in cheap, ill-fitting suits stood on my porch, their silhouettes framed against the brilliant gold of a Colorado autumn. The woman in the center, a brittle-looking blonde with eyes that held the flat, predatory stillness of a hawk, shoved a sheaf of papers toward my face. "You have 48 hours to vacate this property, or we're changing the locks," she announced, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of condescension. I looked at the documents. The letterhead, Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association, Enforcement Division, was slightly pixelated, the kind of thing a moderately skilled amateur could whip up in Microsoft Word. Below it, a list of fabricated violations: construction, improper lawn maintenance, commercial vehicle storage culminated in an impossible figure, $47,000 in accumulated fines. The man to her left, a portly fellow whose suit strained at the buttons, shifted his weight from foot to foot. The other, lanky and nervous, kept glancing back at their idling black SUV, which was parked diagonally across my gravel driveway, blocking me in. The smell of diesel exhaust mingled with the crisp scent of pine and decaying aspen leaves. It was an ugly, industrial intrusion into the peace I had come here to find. I'm Jake Mercer. For 20 years, I was a United States Navy SEAL. I've hunted terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan, navigated hostile negotiations in dusty Capitus, and learned to read the subtle tells of a man about to detonate a bomb. Now, at 45, with a medical discharge and a slight limp from a gracefully intercepted IED, all I wanted was to renovate the modest ranch house my Uncle Roy had left me. I held their obviously photocopied seizure notice. The paper was still warm and smelled faintly of fresh toner from a commercial copy machine. The plastic badges clipped to their lapels had the flimsy, unconvincing look of Halloween costumes, and the lead woman's hands, despite her icy demeanor, were shaking almost imperceptibly. Every instinct honed over 2 decades of special operations began to scream. These people weren't officials. They were predators, running a playbook, and they had just made a catastrophic error in target selection. They picked the wrong house. They had no idea what kind of hell they'd just unleashed. Asterisk 8 months earlier, I'd arrived in Pinewood Springs, a sleepy town of 3,200 souls, nestled in a valley where the Rockies began to flex their granite muscles. After 2 decades of living out of a duffel bag in places most people couldn't pronounce, the idea of permanence was a foreign, intoxicating concept. My Uncle Roy, a man whose quiet stoicism I'd always admired, had passed away and left me his only significant asset, a 2-bedroom ranch house on 3 acres of land, paid in full. The place was a time capsule from the Carter administration. The kitchen cabinets were a dark, oppressive walnut. The bathroom was a symphony in avocado green tile, and the deck boards had the structural integrity of wet cardboard. But it was mine. A clear title, no mortgage. A sanctum. My days fell into a peaceful, purposeful rhythm. I'd wake with the sun, the mountain air so clean it felt like a physical cleanse, and drink coffee on the porch, watching mule deer graze. In the meadow, my hands, calloused from years of gripping rifle stocks and climbing ropes, now held a hammer, a saw, a paintbrush. The ache in my leg was a dull, constant companion, but the focused, physical labor of renovation was a kind of therapy. I was building something, not destroying it. The smell of sawdust was a welcome replacement for the scent of cordite and fear. I craved the anonymity, the quiet respect that small towns afford those who mind their own business. The neighbors were a mix of old-timers who'd been here for generations and retirees seeking the same peace I was. They waved from their trucks, offered advice on dealing with black bears, and otherwise left me to my work. It was perfect. Until Veronica Blackwood. She appeared in my life during my first week of renovations, pulling her gleaming white BMW into my driveway like she was Patton, arriving to inspect the troops. She was in her early 50s, with a meticulously maintained blonde bob and a wardrobe of beige blazers that screamed middle management tyrant. She carried a leather portfolio stuffed with what I would soon learn were homemade complaint forms. "I'm Veronica Blackwood," she'd announced, not offering a hand. "I'm the Community Standards Coordinator for the Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association." That was the first red flag. When I'd inherited the house, my lawyer had done a thorough title search. There were no covenants, conditions, or restrictions. No HOA. "I wasn't aware this street had an HOA," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It's a new initiative," she'd lied smoothly, "to protect property values from unsightliness." She gestured vaguely at the pile of rotted deckboards I'd just removed. Unauthorized construction requires a permit from the association. A few days later, the first notice appeared. In my mailbox, a crisp, white envelope containing a demand for a $500 fine and threatening escalated enforcement action. The paper smelled of cheap printer ink and a special kind of suburban arrogance. I ignored it. The notices kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. Week 3 brought a gem. My grass was allegedly 3.2 inches tall, violating the supposed 3-inch maximum. Another $500 fine. I went out with a ruler, knelt in the damp grass, and measured. She was off by half an inch. But the sheer pettiness was breathtaking. By week 6, my Ford F-150, the most common truck in Colorado, was deemed a commercial vehicle, violating residential parking restrictions. I started asking around. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a sweet widow in her late 70s, whose husband had been a Korean War veteran, confirmed my suspicions. We spoke over her fence, while she tended her immaculate rose garden. Jake, she'd whispered, glancing nervously toward the street, as if Veronica had listening devices planted in the petunias. That woman has been terrorizing folks for months. The Hendersons on Oak Street paid her $1,800 just to make her stop calling the city about their garden gnomes. Her weathered hands, usually steady as she pruned her roses, trembled slightly. She preys on the older folks. We don't want trouble. We just pay. The scent of her prize-winning chocolate chip cookies, which she'd brought over as a welcome gift, couldn't mask the scent of fear. This wasn't just an annoying busybody. This was a predator who had identified a vulnerable herd and was picking them off one by one. Lou, our mailman, a jovial man who'd been walking this route for 12 years, provided the final piece of the puzzle. Never delivered any official HOA documents to your address, Jake, he'd confirmed one afternoon, leaning against his mail truck. Or any of these addresses. If there was a legitimate homeowners association, I'd know about it. We have to be notified of official community mailings. That was it. The confirmation I needed. Veronica Blackwood was running a complete and utter scam. She was using a phantom organization and the threat of legal-sounding jargon to extort money from decent, hardworking people. She had made a critical error in target selection. She thought I was just another newcomer, easily intimidated. She was about to learn the difference between real authority and playground bullying. She was about to find out what happens when you try to run a psychological operation on someone who used to design them for a living. 3 days after my conversation with Lou, Veronica returned with reinforcements. I was carefully replacing a cracked window pane on the south side of the house when I heard car doors slamming. Not one car, but two. The sound of gravel crunching under multiple pairs of feet told me this wasn't a social call. Through the window, I saw her climb out of her BMW, a beige blazer, her armor, a leather portfolio, her weapon. Following her were 2 men I'd never seen before. The first, who looked to be in his mid-40s, and soft around the middle, wore a wrinkled button-down that screamed desperate to be taken seriously. This, I would later learn, was her brother-in-law Rick. The second man was lanky, with the nervous, darting energy of a cornered rodent. His name was Darren. Both carried clipboards and wore the same cheap plastic badges I'd see again during their final disastrous visit. They knocked, and I opened the door, deliberately wiping grease from my hands onto an old rag. I wanted them to see me as a simple handyman, to underestimate me further. Mr. Mercer, Veronica announced, her voice dripping with manufactured authority. I'm here with the HOA enforcement team. Your property is now under emergency management due to persistent violations. Rick puffed out his chest. Sir, we need immediate payment of $5,000 as a compliance deposit, or we'll be forced to initiate asset seizure procedures within 48 hours. I leaned against the doorframe, my posture relaxed, my voice calm. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that a calm demeanor in the face of aggression is a powerful weapon. It unnerves the enemy and forces them off script. Asset seizure procedures. I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That sounds serious. Which court issued the order? The question threw them. Darren fumbled with his clipboard, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool October air. His hands trembled, rustling the papers. Well, it's not exactly a court order, per se, but rather a community enforcement action authorized under the Homeowners Association and which bylaws would those be? I pressed gently. I'd love to see the recorded covenants for this neighborhood. The ones filed with the county clerk, as required by Colorado state law. Veronica's face flushed a blotchy red. Don't you dare question legitimate authority. We have full legal standing to enforce community standards, and your continued violations are affecting property values for every decent family in this neighborhood. It was time to have some fun. My old Navy buddy Mike had become a real estate lawyer after his service. Over beers one night, he'd given me a masterclass in property law, explaining the hierarchy of legal documents and the ironclad requirement for public recording. "Ma'am," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more direct. "I spent 20 years following legitimate authority in some of the world's most dangerous places. I'm very familiar with how real authority operates. So, let's talk specifics. Which section of the county building code requires pre-1980s homes to have vinyl siding? Which state statute governs the maximum height of non-commercial grade lawn grass?" Silence. Rick and Darren exchanged panicked glances. The air was thick with the smell of their nervous sweat and Veronica's expensive, cloying perfume. "I'm not here to debate technicalities," she snapped. "Either you pay the compliance deposit now, or we change the locks tomorrow morning." "With what authority?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "Gentlemen, ma'am, I hope you don't mind me recording this conversation for my records." The effect was instantaneous. Darren took 2 clumsy steps backward, nearly tripping. Rick's clipboard began to visibly shake, but Veronica, trapped by her own narcissism, doubled down. "You can't record us without permission. That's illegal." I smiled. It was the same smile I'd worn when cornering an insurgent leader who thought he was smarter than American Special Forces. "Actually, ma'am, Colorado is a one-party consent state. As a participant in this conversation, I have every legal right to record it. Now, about that court order." They left in a flurry of muttered curses and empty threats. As their cars disappeared down the road, I got to work. Military intelligence training doesn't just vanish when you retire. I photographed their license plates and ran the registrations through a private investigator contact. Rick's registration led to an address that also housed a Kinko's copy center, the same place where all their official documents likely got that distinctive fresh toner smell. But the real bombshells came from my neighborhood intelligence network. Lou, the mailman, reported that Rick had been seen using the Kinko's machines after hours, always paying cash. And Mrs. Chen, over a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls, delivered the critical piece of human intelligence. "That horrible woman tried the same thing on 3 other houses," she said, her voice a mixture of anger and sadness. "The Millers were so scared they moved away last month. But here's the thing, Jake. I saw her collecting money from Mr. Thompson for his mailbox violation. She put the cash straight into her purse. No receipt, no official paperwork, just cash in her pocket. That's when I understood. Veronica Blackwood had made the classic mistake every criminal I'd ever hunted eventually made. She'd gotten greedy, sloppy, and arrogant. She thought she was untouchable. 2 weeks later, Veronica decided to bring out the big guns. Or at least, what she thought were big guns. I was installing new kitchen countertops, the smell of sawdust and adhesive filling the air, when I heard a commotion outside. It wasn't the sound of a normal car. It was the unmistakable, authoritative rumble of a V8 engine, the kind found in police cruisers. Through my window, I watched a black and white patrol car pull up behind Veronica's BMW. But something was wrong. The paint job was too fresh, too glossy. The light bar on the roof seemed slightly crooked, and the man who climbed out moved with the awkward stiffness of someone unaccustomed to wearing a uniform. When he turned, I had to suppress a laugh. Was Rick, stuffed into a polyester sheriff's deputy uniform that looked like a cheap Halloween costume. The fabric strained over his beer gut. His badge was pinned on crooked and the dead giveaway. He was wearing brown loafers instead of black duty boots. Any real cop would rather face a firefight than commit that particular fashion crime. Veronica marched up to my door, Rick trailing behind her like an overgrown, badly dressed lapdog. She held up another freshly printed document. "Mr. Mercer, this is Deputy Richardson from the County Sheriff's Department," she announced triumphantly. "We have a court order for your immediate evacuation from this property." Rick tried to deepen his voice, puffing out his chest. "Sir, you need to vacate these premises within 24 hours or face arrest for contempt of court." I opened the door wider, studying them both with a calm, analytical gaze. In Iraq, I'd learned to spot fake documents and impersonators from 50 yards away. These two were laughably amateur. "Deputy Richardson," I said respectfully, "could I see your badge number and department identification? As you know, Every law enforcement officer in Colorado is required to carry official ID. Rick's face went pale beneath his cheap aviator sunglasses. Well, that's not really necessary, since we have the court order, and I'd like to verify your employment with the sheriff's department, I said, pulling out my phone and starting to dial. It'll just take a moment. The silence stretched. Rick's fake uniform was already showing dark sweat stains. Under the arms, Veronica's left eye had developed a nervous twitch that was almost hypnotic. That evening, she made her next move. She'd reserved the community room at the local library for a community standards hearing. I arrived fashionably late, just as she was launching into a dramatic monologue about how my refusal to comply with basic standards was threatening everyone's property values. She stood at a makeshift podium, wearing her most official blazer. This man has repeatedly violated our neighborhood covenants, she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at me. He refuses to maintain proper lawn height, operates unauthorized construction without permits, and parks commercial vehicles in residential areas. I raised my hand. Ma'am, could you show us these neighborhood covenants? I'd love to see the legally recorded documents. Her face flushed. These matters don't require actually. They do, I said, standing up. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the quiet authority I'd learned commanding SEAL teams. Colorado law requires all homeowner association rules and covenants to be recorded with the property deeds at the county clerk's office. I checked this afternoon. No such covenants exist for our neighborhood. A ripple of murmurs went through the small crowd. Old Mr. Thompson, who'd paid Veronica $2,300 for phantom mailbox violations, looked like he'd been slapped awake. You mean I didn't have to pay those fines? That's when the dam broke. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice shaking with righteous anger. She made us pay $1,800 for our garden gnomes. Said they violated height restrictions. Young Maria Santos from Oak Street chimed in. $1,500 for having the wrong color mailbox. The room erupted as neighbors realized they'd been robbed. But Veronica, in her infinite arrogance, wasn't done. She brought Rick back into the room, still wearing his ridiculous fake uniform. Deputy Richardson will explain the legal consequences of ignoring community standards, she announced desperately. I smiled and held up my phone. Actually, I called the real sheriff's department this afternoon. Deputy Martinez is on his way over to meet Deputy Richardson. Should be an interesting conversation. Rick's face went as white as hospital sheets. He mumbled something about a family emergency and practically sprinted for the exit, his fake badge jangling 5 minutes later. The real Deputy Martinez walked in, a young, sharp professional whose presence radiated genuine authority. He took one look at the chaotic room, then at me, and nodded, double quotes, Mr. Mercer. You're the Navy SEAL who called about the impersonation. The taste of victory was sweeter than Mrs. Chen's homemade cookies. Asterisk. After her public humiliation at the library, Veronica went nuclear. She had clearly never learned the first rule of warfare. When you're losing, don't double down on stupid. 3 days later, Deputy Martinez showed up at my door, looking uncomfortable. Jake, I hate to bother you, he said, the smell of hot metal from my welding project mixing with the cool air. We received a complaint. Veronica Blackwood filed a report claiming you threatened her with physical violence. She's requesting a restraining order. I found myself in Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom, watching Veronica deliver an Oscar-worthy performance. Dressed in black, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, she sobbed about how I was suffering from mental instability and had bragged about hunting terrorists. Judge Coleman, who had been on the bench for 23 years, was unimpressed. Miss Blackwood, do you have any evidence of these alleged threats? Recordings? Witnesses? Well, not exactly evidence, per se, Veronica stammered. The judge turned to me. I stood and calmly explained our interactions, then played the recording from the library meeting. Judge Coleman's eyebrows climbed higher with every word. When it finished, she fixed Veronica with a steel gaze. Miss Blackwood, this recording indicates you've been extorting money and using someone to impersonate a law enforcement officer. Are you aware that both are serious criminal offenses? She denied the restraining order and announced she was forwarding the recording to the district attorney's office. But Veronica's desperation led to her biggest mistake yet. While I was in court, she'd hired 2 new thugs to case my house. What she didn't know was that my paranoid Uncle Roy had installed a military-grade security system. I had high-definition footage of them skulking around my property, discussing which fake violations to plant as evidence. She had crossed the line from petty fraud into criminal conspiracy. It was time to show her what real consequences looked like. That night, sleep was impossible. My instincts, the ones that had kept me alive in 100 firefights, was screaming that I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. This operation felt too organized for a simple neighborhood scam. The next morning, I was at the county records office when it opened. The clerk, a kind, efficient woman named Beverly, helped me search for any liens or encumbrances filed against properties in Pinewood Springs. What we found made my blood run cold. "Oh my," Beverly murmured, her eyes wide. "This is highly unusual. There are 23 properties with recent lien filings, all from the same source. A company called Pinewood Property Solutions." Stared at the screen as document after document appeared. Veronica hadn't just been collecting fake fines. She'd been filing fraudulent liens against her victims' properties, claiming unpaid assessments and legal fees ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. These liens created a cloud on the property titles, making it impossible for the owners to sell or refinance. "Beverly," I asked, my voice tight, "who owns Pinewood Property Solutions?" Her fingers flew across the keyboard, and there it was. The owner was listed as Veronica Steele, her maiden name. The company had been registered 6 months ago, right when her fake HOA campaign began. The full scope of her operation hit me like a freight train. This wasn't random extortion. It was a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme. She was systematically targeting vulnerable homeowners, crippling them with fraudulent liens, and then positioning herself to buy their homes for pennies on the dollar at tax sales or foreclosure auctions. "How many properties has she actually acquired?" I asked. Beverly's face went pale. "3 so far. The Miller property on Oak Street. It sold for $28,000 last month. The market value was listed at $260,000. The Millers, the elderly couple, Mrs. Chen said, had been so terrorized, they moved away. They hadn't just moved. They'd been robbed of their life savings." "There's more," Beverly whispered. "These filings show a co-conspirator at Riverside Title Company. Someone named Marcus Webb has been rubber stamping these fraudulent documents." The pieces finally clicked into place. This wasn't a neighborhood busybody. This was the head of an organized crime ring. This wasn't a job for local law enforcement anymore. This was federal. It was time to call in some old friends. That evening, my kitchen became a tactical operations center. I sat with my secure satellite phone and started making calls. My first call was to Sarah Mitchell, a former naval intelligence officer who'd transitioned to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. We'd tracked terrorist funding networks together in Afghanistan. "Jake Mercer, you old war dog," she said, her voice crackling over the encrypted connection. "Let me guess. You've stumbled into something that requires federal attention." I laid out Veronica's entire operation. Sarah listened, her questions sharp and precise. "Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and organized criminal activity," she summarized. "Plus, if she's crossing state lines, we can add RICO charges. Send me everything you've got, Jake. This sounds like a case waiting to happen." My second call went to Tom Rodriguez, a Marine veteran turned investigative journalist for the Denver Post. Tom had made his career exposing corruption in small towns. A fake HOA, running a real estate fraud ring. Tom's excitement was audible. "Jake, this is front-page material." While I worked my professional contacts, Mrs. Chen organized our neighborhood response. Her living room became a command center, with maps, victim testimonies, and a detailed timeline of Veronica's activities. Lou the mailman had turned his route into an intelligence-gathering operation, mapping the geographic pattern of Veronica's targeting. Deputy Martinez provided the unofficial law enforcement perspective, advising that federal involvement would force every local agency to cooperate. The breakthrough came when Tom's investigation uncovered Veronica's history. She'd run similar scams in Arizona and New Mexico before coming to Colorado. The FBI opened a multi-state investigation. We had assembled what military tacticians call an overwhelming force advantage. Veronica still thought she was dealing with a grumpy veteran. She was about to find out she was at war with the United States government. Veronica must have sensed the walls closing in, because she began to lash out with the fury of a cornered animal. She filed a frivolous lawsuit against me, claiming I'd keyed her BMW, complete with doctored photos. Then, the intimidation turned physical. Mr. Thompson's mailbox was vandalized, spray-painted with the word snitch. The Santos family's tires were slashed. The Henderson's garden gnomes were smashed to pieces. But her biggest mistake was underestimating my network. My FBI friend, Sarah, intercepted communications between Veronica and her associates. They were running mortgage scams and identity theft rings in 3 states. Panicked, Veronica was trying to accelerate her asset seizures before the feds came knocking. Then, she tried to bribe her way out of trouble. She offered Deputy Martinez $10,000 in cash to lose some paperwork. He recorded the entire conversation. She had just added federal bribery charges to her rapidly growing list of felonies. Her final, most vicious gambit was a character assassination. She created fake social media profiles, painting me as a dangerous, unstable veteran, suffering from PTSD and stockpiling weapons. But she got sloppy. The posts included specific details about military operations that no civilian could have known. Jake Sarah said on our secure call, whoever created these posts had access to classified information. That's a federal crime in itself. The FBI's digital forensics team traced the accounts back to Veronica's criminal network in Denver. Her attempt to destroy my reputation had just handed the feds ironclad evidence of cybercrime and misuse of military records. The trap was set. Asterisk. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of mountain air and the promise of long overdue justice. Veronica had called an emergency town hall meeting at the community center, billing it as a public safety forum about my supposed dangerous behavior. She had no idea it was a federal sting operation. The community center was packed. Unmarked, federal vehicles surrounded the building. Inside, FBI agents were scattered throughout the crowd. Veronica stood at the podium, flanked by her last 2 hired thugs, and launched into her final performance, complete with a slideshow of my violations. This man has used his military training to intimidate residents and create an atmosphere of fear, she declared dramatically. That's when I stood up. The room went silent. I walked calmly to the front, my boots clicking on the floor. "Ma'am, thank you for organizing this gathering," I said, my voice carrying through the hall. "You're absolutely right that we have a community problem. You are that problem." I spread a thick folder of documents across her podium. County records, bank statements, federal investigation summaries. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "Veronica Blackwood has been operating a criminal enterprise designed to steal your homes. She's already forced 3 families out of their properties, collecting over $200,000 through organized fraud." The room erupted. I detailed the fraudulent liens, the shell company, the corrupt title agent. That's when Sarah Mitchell stood up from the back, her FBI credentials glinting. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "We have warrants for the arrest of Veronica Blackwood, Richard Blackwood, and Marcus Webb on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering." Federal agents moved in with surgical precision. The hired thugs vanished. Veronica stood alone at the podium, stripped of her fake authority, as Agent Torres placed her in handcuffs. The clicking sound echoed through the stunned silence. Then, the community center erupted in applause that lasted 5 full minutes. Justice, when it finally arrives, sounds like thunder. 6 months later, I sat on my completed front porch, watching the sun rise over the Rockies. The neighborhood had been reborn. Veronica Blackwood was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The judge was particularly unimpressed with her final, tearful performance in court. Her accomplices received sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed authorities to seize everything. Over $340,000 was distributed back to the victims, with interest. The Miller family reclaimed their home. Watching them move back in, seeing their grandchildren play in the yard again, was a victory more profound than any I had experienced in combat. The community built something better from the ashes. Mrs. Chen's coffee gatherings evolved into the Pinewood Springs Neighborhood Defense Network, a permanent program to protect vulnerable residents from scams. The recovered money seeded a community defense fund that provides free legal consultation. Our local victory even led to new state legislation, the Blackwood Act, requiring stricter verification for property liens. My kitchen table has become an unofficial consultation center for veterans facing their own. The network we built has become an informal support system, spanning multiple states. I've found a new mission, a new kind of war to fight. Mrs. Chen still brings me cookies every week. "Knowledge defeats bullies better than any weapon," she says, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who helped save an entire community. The sound of children playing safely, of neighbors helping neighbors, reminds me every day that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight right in your own backyard. Asterisk.